So thank you for joining us here today for this event co-organized by the United States Institute for Peace and Peace Direct. The event will be just a housekeeping. The event will be translated from English to French. So English is on channel 1, French is on channel 2. One of our speakers, Idrassa Barry, will be speaking in French, so we'll have the translation. So as I was saying, today's event is looking at the role of grassroots nonviolent movements in building a just peace. My name is Leslie Connolly. I'm a senior policy analyst here at IPI, working on issues of peace building and sustaining peace. Before I start the panel and the discussion here today, I would like to welcome Ambassador Tangara, the permanent representative of the Gambia to the United Nations, to provide some welcoming remarks and talk a bit about the role of nonviolent movements in the Gambia. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Leslie. I would like to welcome all of you here, ladies and gentlemen, to this very interesting session that we are about to start. And I'm glad to provide the welcoming remarks and talk a little bit about our situation in the Gambia. For those who are not familiar with the Gambia, what I think now we've become notorious and then famous somehow when at some point we organized an election, the ruling party lost the election, the president conceded defeat, and then a week later made a U-turn to denounce the results. But we stood and made sure that the verdict of the people stood. But the main important thing is how they wanted to use the young boys and girls in the country in order to hijack the process. And we all know that sometimes our leaders will use violence to justify their stay in power and then invoke foreign intervention, people meddling in our internal affairs. But in the Gambia, we were able to manage that situation very well. I personally know the one who was responsible for mobilizing the youths for the ruling party, and I spoke to him, and others spoke to the other side also, asking not only the ruling, because they wanted to organize them for a demonstration to say that these results are not fair, that what is happening, it's being masterminded from outside. But they were sensitized, telling them that if you bring two groups of youths on the street, you are creating a recipe for violence. And we don't want to find ourselves in that situation. You will create a situation where there will be fighting, the forces, the military or the police will intervene, and then that will create the kind of chaos that the leaders who want to cling to power are very comfortable with. But the youth were responsible enough not to follow the instruction given by either the ruling party or the opposition. They decided to stay put, to stay at home and wait for the 19th, where the term of the president will expire and people will go by their business peacefully. And I think that's one of the reasons why we were able to avoid a major conflict. On the contrary, people were organizing concerts and just saying he should step down, let him step down. And they were using it in some form of party, and through music, through dances, sensitizing people, saying that we have to respect the verdict of the people, but he must go, and let's not fight. Because after all, if we destroy the country, this is our country, no one will come and build it for us. And I think that was a major breakthrough in the situation of the Gambia. So we'll be more than happy to listen to our brother from Burkina Faso. We know the important role played by Le Ballet Citoyen, and we are looking forward to a very fruitful session, and I wish you all the best and looking forward to this very interesting panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think you touched on the central point of the role of the youth in nonviolent movements and sustaining peace, which is a common theme across our three organizations that are here today. So I'd like to now hand over to Maria Stefan, the director of the Nonviolent program at USIP, one of our partners on this event today, to tell us a bit more about the role of nonviolent movements and the success of nonviolent movements thus far.
So it's actually an honor to speak after the Gambian permanent representative to the UN because of your recent history. And I would say, as someone who studies civil resistance, what happened in the Gambia is one of the most remarkable examples of mass nonviolent mobilization and resistance in recent history. And I was certainly following the Gambia Decides movement and all of the tactics that the youth and others were using to bring people out to vote and to defend the integrity of the vote. And I think actually today is elections, local elections in the Gambia, the first since your remarkable transition of just over a year ago. So it's a pleasure speaking after you. My name is Maria Stefan. I direct the program on nonviolent action at the United States Institute of Peace. USIP, for those of you who don't know, is an independent national institute founded in 1984 by Congress. I should note, in the wake of a mass national grassroots movement. And USIP is dedicated to the proposition that peace is possible, practical, and essential for U.S. and global security. We pursue this vision of a world without violent conflict by working directly with partners on the ground in conflict zones and post-conflict zones. We support activists, organizers, peace builders, and governments with the tools, knowledge, and training to prevent, manage, and mitigate violent conflict. Our program on nonviolent action supports alternatives to violence, to challenge injustices and confront the root causes of violence through nonviolent people power, or collective action that is rooted in communities and builds power from the bottom up. Through research, on and offline training in civil resistance and movement building, and active engagement with civil society and policymakers, USIP is working to advance people power as an alternative to violence and as a motor of enduring peace. And we know historically that nonviolent grassroots campaigns and movements involving tactics like silent marches, sit-ins, demonstrations, boycotts, strikes, street theater, satire, have helped people obtain their human rights, to defend freedoms, and to hold governments accountable. And in some cases, nonviolent resistance has even helped to end civil wars. In fact, my colleague Erica Chenoweth and I found a few years ago, after studying close to 330 violent and nonviolent campaigns from 1900 to 2006, that nonviolent campaigns historically have been twice as effective as violent campaigns in achieving their goals. A major reason for this, as we describe in the book Why Civil Resistance Works, is that nonviolent campaigns attract significantly higher levels of participants and from more diverse segments of society compared to armed struggles. We also found empirically that nonviolent campaigns are major drivers of democratic development, and they tend to contribute to more peaceful societies. And this data point was actually acknowledged in the recently released Pathways for Peace report. So nonviolent direct action methods that dramatize injustices, that raise consciousness, and that shift power without violence have been used in conjunction with dialogue, negotiation, and mediation to dismantle apartheid in South Africa, advance civil rights in the United States, end civil war in Liberia, curb corruption in Burkina Faso and Guatemala, and advance democratic transitions in Tunisia and the Gambia, amongst many other examples. And we are really excited this afternoon to have such a stellar group of peace-building activists to share their stories about how grassroots movements have driven social and political change. We will hear about the challenges that they have faced as movement leaders and how outside actors like those of us in this room can best support grassroots movements without undermining their vibrancy and their legitimacy. One of our participants, I would note, Idrissa Berry, at the very end, has flown all the way from Burkina Faso. He arrived 2 days ago to join this conversation today. So you win, Idrissa, for the person who has come the furthest for this conversation, and welcome. And finally, we are really delighted as USIP to join forces with a wonderful group of co-sponsors. And that includes Peace Direct, who is represented by their US representative, Bridget Moy, who you'll be hearing about from later, and their interim UN representative, Sapna Considine. And then there's also the International Peace Institute, represented by Leslie Connolly. And then I would also like to offer special thanks to my colleague, I don't know if she's in the room, Tabitha Thompson, who did a really wonderful job pulling a lot of pieces together to make today happen. So thank you, Tabitha. In conclusion, I would just note that a shift definitely seems to be occurring in the UN community. This shift is expanding the community's idea of peace building to be more than a post-conflict effort, but a strategy that occurs at every phase of the conflict cycle and includes the voices of local actors and communities, including non-traditional civic groups and movements. The passage of the Sustaining Peace Resolutions and the Secretary General's recent report emphasize the need to engage grassroots actors and communities to build a collective vision for society. And today we'll hone in particularly on how a movement mindset can help build a more just and peaceful world. And just a quick note for those who are into tweeting, if you're tweeting or live streaming, we're using hashtag #PeoplePower4Peace, PeoplePower 4 Peace, and hashtag Peace72 for this event. And I'd like to now turn it back over to Leslie Connolly. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Maria. I think you have framed our discussion and set the stage for us to really start hearing from the voices of our local actors on the ground who work in these movements. As you heard from Maria, nonviolent campaigns are twice as likely to achieve their goals than armed insurgencies. Nonviolent action or civil resistance is a powerful tool that's rooted in communities and relies on ordinary people to address the challenges that they're facing. This connects very much to the notion of peace building and sustaining peace, which must be locally owned and driven by national stakeholders. The international community alone cannot be in the driving seat. And we at IPI and with the partners involved in this event believe that peace builders should be at the center and lead when it comes to sustaining peace. So today is an excellent opportunity for us to hear directly from those working in peace building at a grassroots level and to learn about how us as the international community can better support their work. We have 3 speakers today, Mr. Idrissa Berry from Burkina Faso, Mr. Kwaskandi Abdullah Sharif from Sudan, Ala Quisladi from Tunisia, and Ms. Chelsea Payne from the Peacebuilding Support Office, who will be responding to the comments we have today. Their bios are in the PAX list that you have in front of you, so I won't take up any time on this. And I would just like to say for the format of today's panel, we're going to give each speaker about 3 minutes to give some introductory remarks on their organizations. And after that first round, I'll then ask each one of our 3 peace builders some direct questions relating to nonviolent movements and sustaining peace. After we finish the panel, I'll allow Chelsea to provide some discussant or respondent remarks that will connect these movements and the notion of nonviolent movements as a tool to sustain peace and how this connects to the UN's current agenda. And we hope to have about 30 minutes for questions and answers, as I'm sure we have a lot of experience in the room here today. So without further ado, I will turn over to Mr. Idrissa Berry to open the panel for today.
Okay, merci.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to say I'd like to say thank you to all those who have allowed us to assist and to be here in this event. I'd like to listen to the public. I would like to say that I'm very happy to be here with you, especially with the brothers who are coming from Tunisia, Sudan, and Gambia. I think about my brother and the ambassador. There are several identical situations. I have 2 minutes and I wanted to underline certain aspects. I'd like to say that in Burkina Faso, the Citizens Palace is a movement that was created in 2013. It's a year that is very important, and we have this will. That was this will by the president to fix the constitution for the fifth time to draft the constitutions. The whatever comes through violence is going to be maintained through violence. The result is that the government does not answer to the needs of the population. Half of the Burkinabe population was born under this regime. And for us to know that this person is going to hold office for 5 or 10 years more, it is unthinkable. It is a regime that lasts that much. It's not a democratic regime. There's no voice for the people, and it's a regime. Even if the civil society exists, it looks like it's a democratic regime, but it's not really a democratic regime. The checks and balances are not strong. There's no power to check on the government. The activists, the artists, and all of those have been jailed. We have to stand together in order to fight this situation. How can we do this? We think that we could not do that through violent means, because if we follow this path, we're sure that the regime is going to win, because we don't have the weapons that the regime has. The president has 1,300 people in the army and militias inside the army. The president has the support of a certain section of the society, so the main or the only path is the peaceful path. I have 1 minute left. I will answer some questions later on. We organized ourselves, and the first step was to create awareness within the society, in the neighborhoods, in order to for them to join the movement. This was a youth movement with the opposition political parties. We have formed a great and huge coalition between June 2013 and October 2014. There were peaceful marches, and there was not one fire shot, one arm, and no one was shot. Only in October 2014, when the regime wanted to use force, violence started. The National Assembly was ransacked, and this is due to the stubbornness of the regime, the current regime, to stay in power and not to listen to the voice of the people. Violence came from the regime. We have lost 30 people. There was not even one drop of blood from members of the regime. All the victims were demonstrators. During the coup d'etat in September 2015, we organized civil resistance in order to combat the existence of the president's regime. There was not one drop of blood from the regime was lost, but 15 demonstrators died. But for us, it is very important to show the force of the people against the military regime, and we were able to restore the transition, the political transition, and I'll stop here.
Great, thank you, Idirasa. I think you really have highlighted how effective a peaceful, nonviolent movement can be, and the fact that no blood was lost at all, and you've been working so well, including all aspects of society, really gives us a lot of food for thought. I would like to now turn over to my colleague on the left, Mr. Ala Krislati, who is with a fellow at Women Deliver from Tunisia, to really just give us a few minutes outlining your organization and your views on nonviolent movements.
Thanks, Leslie. So I am a fellow. I was a fellow for Women Deliver 3 years ago. We work on women's reproductive and sexual health and rights in the Middle East and Africa. And for us, that is one of the many ways that we contribute to building peace and to sustaining peace, is to guarantee and to safeguard women's rights that are sometimes considered as taboos or things that are not worth discussing. So I'm from Tunisia, which means I'm a troublemaker, a peaceful troublemaker at least. It looks like nowadays you can no longer be a change maker without being a troublemaker, so it's actually a good thing to be a troublemaker in this part of the world, in this region that has been perceived as the birthplace of conflict and war for so many years. And today, if I would have the honor to represent Tunisian youth, the authors and the owners of the revolution of Tunisia of 2011, and the Arab Spring as a whole, actually, when I was living and traveling in Tunisia and around the Middle East and North Africa, I was able to see and witness the many ways that young people in the region perceive these notions of peace, of conflict, of peace building, of peacekeeping, etc., etc. And they were mobilizing themselves individually and in groups to change and challenge the status quo, and they change the narratives in their regions. I heard many accounts from people, the ways they organize themselves peacefully and non-violently to reach a purpose or an outcome that has been overlooked by the government because of the current rapidly changing political scene in the country. And frankly, this has been the model in many countries around the region as well, in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Yemen. Those unfortunately took different paths. I focused on women's reproductive and sexual health and rights because it was something that was not discussed in Tunisia, and because women were dying because of this, and there was no initiative and no intervention to do something about it. And Women Deliver, what it does is that it tackles this issue from a holistic perspective that does contribute to what we call societal peace. Because if someone is denied the most basic rights to access healthcare and to access equality in treatment, to be fair, then they will not have an interest or willingness to contribute to peaceful society and to building and sustaining peace in their countries. Maslow's pyramid, it's really as simple as that. And we have also, as Tunisian youth, engaged online, and we used this platform that Facebook and Twitter have given us to really find like-minded people who were passionate and who wanted to speak up and who wanted to challenge the government and to challenge very rudimentary and old ways of dealing with societal problems, especially in the Midlands, far away from the capital city of Tunis. And these online movements then became on-the-ground movements that brought together people who are involved in art, in film, in theater, in different ways to have their message go across to the recipients. And this time there was no echo, really. This message did get to the government, and they did do something to challenge this because they felt pressured and there was an influence. And the best thing that we can do, obviously, is to prevent conflict in the first place. So that's what these young Tunisians have been doing since the revolution. It's the smartest thing to do. It's the least resources spent on peace building, and on keeping peace is the most efficient and effective thing to do. So because we know what is better than building peace is actually to sustain peace that has already been built before, and that's where the Tunisian successful model for young people comes out and stands out in a crowd of a lot of chaos in the region. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Ala. I think you've really highlighted the integral nexus of peace and development, and how, as external actors, we really need to work with what's already working on the ground and understand the society in order to assist in sustaining peace. So now I'm going to turn to our last speaker, Chris Kondi from Peace Direct in Sudan, to really talk about the same point, your organization and your connections to the nonviolent movement.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's an honor for me to come here and talk to you about the part of my experience and tell you more about Sudan. You all know Sudan is one of the most conflict-ridden countries. For over last 50 years, we have the most strongest rebel movements in the country. Throughout all these years, we claim it about 2 million people have been killed due to this violent conflict. Just to give a brief on what I was been doing, I was part of the student movement started in the Darfur War when I was in university, and there was really a very deep and long legacy of students in the universities being part of the change and taking action in nonviolent movement to challenge the state of quo in the country. And throughout that, I also have to leave the country. I have been working in East Africa for the last 10 years, trying to support the youth movement and peace processes in Sudan. Last summer, I started joining Peace Direct as one of the organizations that really try to search the local voices to support the peace process within the country. And that was really another opportunity for me to practice my activism and support the peace building efforts in Sudan. Just to give a very short view, we have throughout the history of the conflict in Sudan that challenged the central power through the armed movement. None of them have been successful in making a real political change. We have two dictator governments that have been changed by peaceful movement. So Sudan is one of the first countries in Africa and Middle East in October 1964 to make a peaceful change through the peaceful nonviolent action in the capital city and the biggest city across the country. In 1985, we did the same. But the armed movement that really with all this kind of violence that happens, they only create one major change. That was in 2005 by signing of Sudan Comprehensive Peace Agreement, which in the end resulted in two failed states instead of one failed state, which we have South and North Sudan, conflict-ridden, become more deteriorated. We have a youth population for 64% of the population are below 30 and above 15 years old, and the literacy rate is 89%. The unemployment is extremely high among the young population and youth, and national economy is really unproductive, is stagnating, while most difficult is that there is a very strong repression against the civil movement in the country, and we have already prevailing available alternative option as the rebel movement just go and join. So Sudan is one of the countries that will really be more benefited from the peace building architecture that United Nations has signed, and particularly any effort to really support nonviolent movement through different kind of support that is possible. So that is what I can say in a nutshell. And furthermore, we can discuss in due time that is coming. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kuskandi. And I think that I'm going to pick up from where you left off, touching on the sustaining peace resolutions and the peace-building architecture. And just if you can reflect in your experience how the nonviolent movements can advance this goal of sustaining peace, and how we as the international community can better support your work.
In 2003, I was a student in the university, and suddenly the war broke out in the region. The same day we wake up, we don't know where our families are. Everything is destroyed. We were angry and we were afraid, even for ourselves in the university. There was only two options. Actually, one which was most viable is to travel to Darfur and join armed movement and fight the government to be part of the cause. Other option was to use the agency you have as a student to try to struggle and challenge the situation and build peace through the activism. We choose the latter. And that was so much helpful that many young people have been able to complete their universities. And in my experience, that because of this alternative, majority of the students that graduated in university choose to go for peaceful nonviolent action than to join the violent movement. And that really gives me to say, in my experience, to just give some more view of what that means, a nonviolent action to the country like Sudan when you have as alternative available. Because of as I explained it, there is very high unemployment rate. People feel like we have a government that for 30 years arrest, torture, and kill the students, really control the media, and public life is so much intoxicated. It is very difficult for someone, a development practitioner or peace builder, to say, oh, this situation will stay like this. So it is usual that there has to be conflict, there has to be movement. If we really try to protect and nurture the nonviolent movement, that will be the more attractive option and alternative. So what I'm seeing this in my view and my experience, something else that I could say, the armed movement, for instance, or the violent movement is only a practical practice of masculinity, and it's only men work. And when it comes to peace negotiation and representation, women didn't represent. And one thing I will tell you, the lead of the nonviolent movement in Sudan are women. In the last 3 months, there was a nonviolent movement in Sudan. 35% of the activists arrested were women. Means they were in the front line. Journalists, activists, human rights activists, all these were women that really in the front line saying no and challenging the situation. That gives them the agency to participate. Not only women, even children. They feel that kind of ownership and participation. So one advantage of the nonviolent movement is really allows equal participation in the cause, reduces gender disparity, and it is accessible to poor and rich, and everyone can do and take part. So in that way, it is really a most strongest way, not only to change the situation, but also to build dialogue and understanding from different groups of people. One thing that I see this, the peace building architecture is not that only. It's really a paradigm shift of the way peace building done and the way the development practice is being implemented by different agencies. It allows to have really a global view and cooperation between different agencies, which is like something so much important. It's really, particularly in a countries where you have an autocratic system telling you what to do, what not to do. The development work, it just goes in a very chaotic silos without it ending up being really more problematic and supporting the systematic inequality that exists in the ground. With stronger civil society participating in a decision-making process can be a very, very useful tool and helpful way that you can really avoid promoting the existing inequality and promote like equal development process and equal understanding of the intervention that you are making. So just to conclude, for me, as somebody who hopes to see peace, but also most strongly believe that that peace could only be sustainable and be viable in my country if it happens through stronger civil society involvement and a stronger nonviolent movement that could really allow vertical and horizontal dialogue among the society. I see this as a great opportunity for me to see that things happen, taking an action and or seeing a very nice examples that happened this year from Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, not Ethiopia and Gambia. I really see it as a very, very good, and even South Africa. So I feel this is like a so much encouraging dynamics that give support on that makes me feel that this is the right thing to do and it's actually the right time. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kuskondi. I think that you've really touched on this point of an inclusive nature and the fact that we must have women involved and women as the frontline actors, as you were saying, in your country. And I think that connects very much to what Ala has been talking about with Tunisia and the role of women in the nonviolent campaign. So I turn to you, Ala, and ask the same question. How can we as an international community really support the work of your organization on the ground and better advance this goal of sustaining peace?
So in the case of Tunisia, we had a relatively more favorable environment for nonviolent activism, because whether we like it or not, there has to be one. There has to be an environment that makes it possible for nonviolent movements to rise up and to find each other and to contribute to building a peaceful society. Unlike many contexts where it has almost been impossible for nonviolent action to erupt and to exist because of the oppression and the pressure and the unfavorable circumstances in their societies. But what do Tunisians have in special that other people in the region don't have? Simply, it's options. People in Tunisia, the youth, they have options that did not exist prior to the revolution. And these options and these recourses have been brought by young people themselves when they started the revolution in 2011 in January. These options range from ways they can contribute directly to policy making and to decision making locally and nationally. We have the municipal elections coming up very soon, next month, and Tunisian young people and their youth-led movements have been pushing and promoting for young people to join these elections and to go and cast their votes next month, and therefore play a role in setting the future of the country and in this transitional and democratization process that the country is going through. There was also this movement where young Tunisians have gathered themselves to oppose a law that has been adopted in 2015, which contained major breaches on the rules of fair trial and gave impunity to former members of the former dictatorship regime and gave them power to actually function and operate within the parliament. And young people protested through artistic creations, through theaters, through street art, through music, to express their disaccord with this and to tell the government that we are holding you accountable for your actions and that we are not allowing any of this to happen. So it was either the voice of young people or the sound of rubber bullets and tear gas, to be honest. And the government was wise enough to choose the voice of young people. The harassment in public transportation is something that is very widespread in the region, not as much in Tunisia, but we still had the obligation to find ways to tackle this as a way to promote peace building in the country. And this movement was called Harassers Don't Ride With Us. It was launched by young people. And what's fascinating about it is that it actually drove the attention and the endorsement of companies such as the Tunisian Company of Transportation and the Ministry of Transportation itself. They played a role in this campaign to say no to harassers in public transportation, because a society where harassers can get away with their actions is one that cannot sustain peace. The youth networks and organizations have also been recognized by the country and the government, and they now have a platform and they have a voice that is valid unlike how it used to look like before the revolution. And there's this new philosophy of standing for each other, for people who are different, for basically for women, for people of minorities such as LGBT, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, etc., etc. And there's this social fabric that is new and is unified and strengthened by this spirit of the revolution that make people stand for each other even though they are different from each other. And the country is also, the government has also been prioritizing investment in youth. There's this Startup Act, which was passed last week, and it basically turns Tunisia into a startup nation. And I find this incredibly amazing because it gives young people a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, so they can contribute to maintaining peaceful societies through their belonging in entrepreneurial projects and their startups. And I think there has to be a way to make people feel that they belong somewhere, because if they don't feel like they belong somewhere, they will belong to organizations such as ISIS, which gives them a platform, an alternative, a preference, basically. Now, all of these points that I've just mentioned actually are the key core values of something called the Amman Declaration, which was adopted in 2015 following a global forum that gathered 500 government representatives. There will be so many governments, and young people from different countries affected by war and conflict. And this youth declaration forum basically tackles the way young people can contribute to youth, peace, and security, the international agenda that has been set by the United Nations. But unfortunately, young Tunisian people were not approached by international organizations, and international media outlets and governments and organizations have not learned or examined or studied in any way the Tunisian experience in regards to young people, at least not the good experiences. I think international news outlets were so busy writing whether Tunisia was safe for British tourists to go back to the country to tan on the beaches, and they were writing about whether it was safe to invest in the country economically rather than the experience of young people. And this was followed by many attempts, no less preposterous, to damage the country's democratization success story and to stall our momentum, basically, and to damage our progress, which was labeled as a secular, liberal, anti-Islamist process in the country, which drove a lot of controversy. Young people in generally, to conclude, have just been playing a very effective role that they didn't want to back from in terms of opposing unfair laws and crude and rudimentary decisions that once were made in rooms full of old men in times where these men had no clue how it is like to live as an unemployed woman or man in the Midlands in Tunisia, who had no clue what peace building and peace and sustaining peace meant, and therefore had no contribution and no role in playing this game of sustaining peace in the country. And we actually got to the point where we were opposing everything from protesting every single decision on law, because it was almost as if the country is by default wrong, and we were opposing and protesting everything, which I think is a good sign, because it's good to hold officials accountable. And lastly, the most important thing that we have done in Tunisia as young people is really to inspire and to motivate and to promote in this peer-to-peer education and peer-to-peer call to safeguard each other's rights and to do what we believe is right for the country and for ourselves and for our families, and to use whatever platforms that we have, and to use this liberal and secular opportunity that the revolution has brought to us to drive change collectively, and to say no to corruption and to say no to injustice and inequality. And I think that's one thing that we can learn from the Tunisian youth experience that I hope will be applied in other contexts around the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Ala. I think you really You really give us a lot of inspiration that we can draw from Tunisia. And I know here at IPI, we're often looking at the positive cases, what we can learn from where peace has been successful and how to draw lessons from that. And Tunisia has been a case that we've looked at quite a lot. And I think your point about providing this alternative to violence is central. If violence is the only means to have your voice heard, it's no wonder that we have so many violent movements. And so I now turn to Idrasa as our to wrap up our points, to look again at the same question around how sustaining peace has really played a role within your nonviolent movement and how the international community can support the work within Burkina Faso.
Okay, merci.
Thank you. How can international organizations help movements such as ours to building peace in nationally? This organization, it starts with the United Nations, where they have to be more attentive and listen to these movements, be in a dialogue with these movements. What we've noted is that in these whole efforts, in this fight, this whole trajectory of fighting, these organizations where the UN, these organizations are not very present at the UN. You only see them when the crisis has spun out of control. In our experience in Burkina Faso, from 2013 to the popular uprising in October 2014, we didn't really have much to do with international organizations such as the UN or others. This despite the fact that we need the moral support of such organizations. So I think if there are any recommendations or wishes that should be expressed here, is that these organizations should listen to these popular movements that are struggling there, in the field, in the front line, and to really get involved, analyzing the context of each situation so that we can take into account their needs, their concerns in preparing peacekeeping, peace-building policies in those countries, and of course assisting them when they decide to, that they have concrete actions that they will be able to carry out in the field. That's what I can say, because in our case, as I said, we have felt that we have only felt their presence afterwards, when when there was already a crisis. That's when the ECOWAS, the United Nations, it's when there was the coup in 2015 that these organizations finally showed up, which was good. Some of them played a very positive role in Africa. They took their positions right after the coup and condemned it, but other organizations, ECOWAS, were not so vocal. So I would exhort all these organizations to be by our side, by the side of citizen movements, to understand their motivation, to understand how they fight, what motivates them, what do they do in the field, what are their objectives, what do they wish for, what do they want for their countries. That is very significant. There's another thing I could possibly add. It's an example of our experience with USIP regarding a place near the capital city called Sabah. There was a total security vacuum throughout these years of poor governance under the former regime, which led to the creation of self-defense groups, vigilante groups, because the police, the gendarme, national police, the army are not present. And when they're there, they're actually inefficient, they're corrupt. So the population didn't trust these security forces anymore, which led the citizens themselves to take responsibility for their own security, using these vigilante organizations, which of course can lead to all kinds of abuses, of course. So in Burkina Faso, along with help from Egypt, in a place called Sanaba, we tried to pull together all these vigilante groups with the police, the security forces, that is the police, to talk and to see how they can build back up this trust that has been lost. Today, it is safe to say that these efforts have been crowned with a certain success. At first, nobody wanted to sit and talk together, whether it were the police and the vigilantes. They would just stare at each other. But after 2 years in the field, people are collaborating, they're talking to each other. When the vigilante groups stopped presumed delinquents, they bring them to the police, and the police also go to the vigilante groups to get information, because they're in the field, they're in the villages, they're everywhere, which is not always the case with the police. So we're consolidating these relationships based on trust, mutual trust, and the current government is also supporting us in these efforts because they think it might spread and be an example, a pilot project that could be implemented in other places to establish a dialogue between the population and the security forces throughout Burkina Faso. In the north of Burkina Faso, in the Sahel region, they are affected by terrorism, and in the fight against terrorism, we have noted that the public authorities, security forces, don't always have the best strategies. They often arrest people who are suspected of collaborating with the terrorist groups. It could be true or not, but they become suspects. And then once they're suspects, you can't just go and execute them. While we're getting feedback that information that this is actually happening in the field. And at Ballet Citoyen, our association, we are obliged to report on these occurrences, making them public so the army, the state, can correct these abuses. You cannot have the citizens on your side if you start to arrest people and they just disappear. Society, parents don't hear about these people anymore. So how can people trust this army to fight against terrorism if the people cannot distinguish between the armed groups and the national army? So this is a big challenge. So what is being done at Sanaba could be a small-scale model that could be maybe carried out in the Sahel, next to the alongside the military and the police branches. You would have a trust-building partnership with these forces.
Thank you, Irasa. I think that you really highlight for us that peace building takes a long time, and it's not something that we can expect to change overnight. And central to this is the process of building up a relationship and building trust with the community. And the only way to do that is by actually listening to the people. As we say at IPI, peace is locally driven, regionally anchored, and internationally supported, and that has to be central to all the work that we do. So we now have Chelsea Payne with us here today, who has been a key drafter in the Peace Building and Sustaining Peace report, which was recently released by the Secretary General, and really highlights how the UN strategy among sustaining peace and how to advance this goal is going to take shape over the next few years. And we have her here today to really just sort of connect this discussion to the UN context and how grassroots movements are central to this discussion on sustaining peace.
Well, thank you, Leslie, and many thanks to IPI and Peace Direct and USIP for convening this very rich and informative discussion, particularly timely as we are now 2 weeks away from the high-level meeting on peace building and sustaining peace to be convened by the President of the General Assembly. And what I wanted to do in these few minutes was first of all, bring us back to some of the core themes and messages around sustaining peace that Maria emphasised right from the beginning, and then to quickly connect some of the themes that we've heard come through from the interesting discussion this afternoon, and how they might link with some recommendations in the Secretary-General's report. And then I wanted to touch on the independent progress study on youth, peace and security, because as I'm sure you all agree, the role of youth as change agents in support of sustaining peace is something that's come through really strongly today. And the progress study has some really interesting recommendations for the UN and the international community in general. So I think right from the beginning, we've really been able to hear and practice how sustaining peace is about enhancing coherence of international engagement and support of country-led efforts to build peaceful and resilient societies. An essential message of the SG's report is that this requires a more integrated, strategic and coherent approach across the whole UN system and by member states. The Secretary-General has prioritised prevention, and we've heard in some of the remarks today how important it is to be listening from early stages and not for the UN to only be engaging in times of crisis. This means bringing together our work in peace and security, human rights, development, and also in humanitarian action. And colleagues have also reinforced the importance of this change in mindset, the important role that inclusive sustainable development, for instance, plays in peace building and sustaining peace. And this idea that sustaining peace is not only post-conflict or in times of crisis, but stretches across the entire peace and conflict continuum. Ultimately, sustaining peace is the responsibility of member states, but both the resolutions on the review of the peacebuilding architecture and the SG's report really put this emphasis on inclusive national ownership. And that's what we've heard a lot about today, that partnerships, peacebuilding and sustaining peace are about partnerships, and they're about working with actors beyond the UN. It's about regional and sub-regional organizations, IFIs and other multilateral institutions, but also, as importantly, with civil society, local actors and communities. And sustaining peace can only be realized through people-centered approaches and committed national, inclusive national ownership. So very briefly on the report on the Secretary-General on Peacebuilding and Sustaining Peace, there's a number of recommendations that try to enhance partnership, particularly with civil society and communities, and with a particular focus on women and youth groups. One of them is the recommendations that UN peace operations and UN country teams develop community engagement strategies in consultation with local and national stakeholders. And the Secretary-General also takes the opportunity to welcome the Peacebuilding Commission's inclusion of civil society with a particular emphasis on field-based civil society organisations. And I think this is a point that Idrissa really highlighted, that you need these types of mechanisms for listening, and not only in times of crisis. So we've seen, for instance, in the Liberia configuration of the Peacebuilding Commission, the opportunity for civil society networks doing work around the monitoring of the elections last year to share their views. We've seen a multi-stakeholder forum held in Liberia with the Peacebuilding Commission, and the ability of the Commission to relay these perspectives of civil society in its advisory role to the Security Council also. The report also has a number of recommendations around programming and funding of civil society organisations. So, for example, the Peacebuilding Fund's work in its Gender and Youth Promotion Initiative has seen funding go directly to civil society organisations as direct recipients, with projects totalling some 40 million since it started in 2016. And also a mechanism that requires 40% of funding to be allocated to local civil society organisations as implementing partners also. And this is really a recognition that we need to be able to test innovative approaches, and we need to be engaging underutilised constituencies for peace. The Peacebuilding Fund also partners with civil society on a range of other endeavours, including some of its monitoring and evaluation work. In the report, the Secretary-General makes the call for UN funding windows for civil society organizations to include a focus on youth-led organizations. And that's something that's also come through very strongly today. The importance of the international community to tap into the peace-building potential of youth organizations. And oftentimes this means improving access to funding, to technical support, and capacity building. There's also a recommendation in there that all UN funding mechanisms in support of peacebuilding projects meet and exceed the 15% target of all UN-managed funding in support of peacebuilding projects to advance gender equality and women's empowerment as a principal objective. But in the remaining time I have, I want to concentrate on something that's not related so much to the programming and funding part of what the UN and international community can do to engage with nonviolent and youth organizations and women's groups, but rather on the importance of the space that the United Nations should be supporting. And at the beginning of the high-level week, in 2 weeks' time, there will be an open debate in the Security Council that will consider the independently authored progress study on youth, peace and security, pursuant to Security Council Resolution 2250, the missing piece. And this report will assume an important role in shaping the UN's peacebuilding engagement with youth in years to come. It's time that we recognise that young people are critical contributors to peace and security, and that we change our modus operandi to let them drive us to a peaceful world with their knowledge, ideas, and initiatives. Certainly that's what we've heard about this afternoon. And the report really underlines that young people are powerful challengers of the status quo through peaceful protest, social critique and cultural expression, and in recent years, online mobilization. And this is a long-standing and perhaps universal dimension of the change agency of youth. And protests and dissent are some of the most important tools for youth-based movements struggling for political change and justice. And it's really critical that the space for these social movements be protected. And this depends on the realization of rights to freedom of expression, freedom of association, assembly, movement, all enshrined, of course, in the UN Charter. And the Independent Progress Study makes a host of recommendations to ensure that the meaningful and inclusive political participation of youth is protected. And so just to quickly touch on some of those, it recommends, for example, that the UN should support member states in the upholding of young people's universal and fundamental rights of organisation, peaceful assembly, association and expression. It talks about preserving the integrity of rule of law institutions that also nationally help to protect young people's human rights. For example, safeguarding from arbitrary arrests and incarceration, equal access to justice and accountability. It also talks about broadening the engagement of human rights institutions and processes with young people to ensure their participation in these entities. For example, through human rights treaties bodies and special procedures. And then finally, and particularly relevant to my colleague from Tunisia was talking about, it makes a recommendation around prioritising the mental health and physical well-being of young people through increased funding and provision of age and gender-sensitive health services, including psychosocial and sexual and reproductive services. So all to say that this independent progress study is really an important part of sustaining peace in the youth, peace and security agenda. And the recommendations that it makes, I think, are very timely and relevant to the discussion today, because it talks about changing the way that the UN does business and paving the road for a UN more open to young citizens around the world. So thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you, Chelsea. I think you've given us a lot of central points, and I think as you raised, the Youth Progress Study is much anticipated to contribute to the current reforms within the UN context. So we now have about 20 minutes for some questions and answers. I think the idea is that we'll take a few questions and then turn it back to the panel for them to comment. So if you have a question, if you could just raise your hand and just mention where you're from and be brief in your remarks, please.
Thanks. My name is Jonathan Rosen with the Committee to Protect Journalists. I'm interested in what role journalists have played or should be playing in the peace movements in your countries. In particular, I'd be interested in Idrissa Berry's comments on that. Thank you.
Yeah, the gentleman.
Hi, my name is Sergio Martinez, and I'm coming from Washington, D.C. I'm working for an international NGO, 3IE Impact. I have a question about the concept of monitoring and evaluation of sustaining peace interventions that are going to take place. Especially, I'm concerning about what particular approach does the United Nations recommend in this regard, and what could be the potential benchmarks of best practices in terms of sustaining peace and nonviolent action moments. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? Yeah, this gentleman in the front.
Thank you. I'm Shahid Hussain, a United Nations retiree, presently advising the UN Office for South-South Cooperation. I've heard with very great interest the presentation by our very distinguished members on the panel. And one point that has struck me, not just now, but it has been developing for quite some time in my mind. And I say this as a former youth leader myself, and one who originated the UN volunteer scheme in UNDP, and later on helped in the establishment of the Islamic Conference Youth Forum for Dialogue and Cooperation. Much of what we demanded for the youth, for the betterment of the youth, for the improvement of the youth, for civil rights of the youth, for healthcare benefits, education, and so forth. I think in some instances, we could not help being unrealistic of the realities of the situation in which we have been considering and making these demands. The progress of human rights and availability of other benefits and facilities for the youth surely cannot go ahead of the progress that may have been attained or that may be needed for the society at large, for the adults. I mean, let us see what kind of human rights are available to people in general in a certain society, in places that you are coming from. Are we expecting that the rights of and facilities for the youth should go beyond those, or should they be within the framework of the progress in social and economic development of the people that's evident in the country? I think it would be more realistic and better that while continuing to seek the betterment of youth leadership through youth leadership programs, youth entrepreneurship programs, etc., we should at the same time make an effort to work within the framework of the developmental process of the country, so that the benefits to the youth may be arrived realistically and within the framework of the progress the society makes. Thank you.
Great, thank you. If there are one or two more questions, we can take those before turning back to the panel to respond. If not, then I'm going to turn it back, and perhaps I'll ask you, Idrissa, if you would like to respond first.
Okay. Merci au confrère.
Media has played a very important role in the different struggle that we had in Burkina Faso. We have to know that the media has been really our power, because the classical power, which is the opposition, was not very well organized and was not really credible. So the media on the field is what played a great role as a power for us. You have heard about the journalist Norbert Jango, who was assassinated in 1998, and we're still waiting for justice with regard to this journalist. This assassination has created a great popular movement with the students. At the time, I was a student, and we have participated greatly in the fight against impunity. The engagement of youth has lasted since that time. The media has played a great role in 2013, 2014 with the emergence of the citizens movement in the public space. The media has really given a forum for them to speak so that the public space is not only occupied by politicians. So there's the emergence of new actors, and this is thanks to the media somewhat, because they were interested in this movement, and they have concentrated and highlighted this movement on the field, and they have conducted analysis and studies of this movement. I believe that many journalists share the ideals for which we fought and we fight. Several journalists were fighting on the side of this citizens movement on the field without being influenced by any party. They were neutral, and they highlighted the need to make the change.
Great, thanks, Idrasa. Kuskondi, any comments?
Yeah, thank you. I will just answer, I think, with the role of journalism, and will answer with Shahid. Journalism is crucial in particularly ensuring the rule of law and fighting corruption, and also connecting the broader civil society and coordinating the way things done. And civil society itself is also just the same. It's also kind of practice of power. And I think the journalism as medium, it really plays a very strong role in ensuring how things been done. But to go to Mr. Hussein, Shahid Hussein, he was asking why we try to consider youth development like to supersede the overall societal. I don't think it is necessary that, but we should really consider that the youth has particularly specific demands and needs that are completely different from people in the elder age. The young age is really critical for everyone. And not only that, for instance, in Africa, where you have countries like Kenya, where 70% of population are young people. And the importance of youth comes that we have political institutions that established it in 1960s. And they think the same way. We are different, completely in different world. It's very wrong and mistake to think that the young people right now are the same as the one just 10 years ago. Completely different. Without really designing an separate kind of way that we will see the overall society in an angle that youth see, because youth are the future. The future is for the young people. It's not for the old. So I don't think that there is an isolation, but what you say about the frameworks, I searched about, for instance, how many countries have youth policies in Africa. Very few of them. But I was seeing in 2006, African countries signed it in Banjul, African Youth Charter. So beautiful, nice. But in the same year after they signed this charter, in 2014, 15, and 16, what happened? Over $8 million in 1 year paid just to block internet and WhatsApp in Ethiopia and Uganda. I have been in Uganda in election, what happens? So framework itself doesn't solve anything. And actually in a political context, in sometimes the government puts the framework so to avoid questions from UN, from other framework, without having really a mechanism. Oh, we have this, we did this, oh, it's so beautiful. So that is not enough, without really having a strong mechanism to follow up and do this. So youth demands are completely different from the way the current institutions have been set. And that is why youth have been alienated, not only in the job market, not only in the society, but they're really alienated from the real life of the society itself. Without having any specific, targeted, deliberate interaction to address youth demand, there will never be peace, there will never be stability, they will remain reluctant, and really it will hinder all our efforts to make peace or development in those countries. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Ala, I'll turn over to you now for any remarks.
So from my side, I think the more a government or a state is violent and negligent towards its youth, then inevitably the more violent will erupt from and within the youth. And there are motives and reasons behind violence and behind conflict. It's not accidental, it doesn't happen spontaneously. There are things behind it, and the job is to make these motives impossible so that we will not have ourselves in the stage of peacekeeping and keeping peace and conflict resolution. It has to be addressed from day one. And to go back to your question, this is the very link that actually answers this question, because when a government invests in its national development, then it's very unlikely that there will be violent actions erupting from youth, from young people. And that's what our governments around the Middle East and North Africa has been failing to do for so long, until they find themselves obligated to find solutions to fix the problem after it has already been erupted. One thing that in Tunisia we're trying to change is to change the perception of youth investment and the perception of using and investing in youth skills, youth knowledge, youth potential, and their degrees as well, for those who have higher education, to solve the country's problems. Basically, we're going through an economic crisis nowadays. We're going through a transitional process. We're still learning how to join the club of international democracies, and we're also learning how to promote values of equality and justice. And when the government invests in creating a platform that creates jobs, that reduces unemployment, that promotes and invests in healthcare for everyone with no exceptions and with no discrimination, that builds its infrastructure in a way that young people feel more supported and feel that they live in a favorable environment that makes them motivated but also interested in investing in their own countries. I think these go line in line. There really is no other way around it, unless in some cases people flee the country and they go to illegal migration, and that's a whole different topic. But I think your point is very valid. There has to be a national development plan before talking about youth engagement in peace building. And for the point for the media, I think in Tunisia, if it wasn't for the media, there would be no revolution and there would be no democratization. So if you're a journalist, we value your work, and it's for people, thanks to people like you in my country, that we've been able to emancipate and to liberate ourselves and to create a new future for the next generations. Thank you.
Great. Chelsea, over to you.
Just to quickly pick up on the question about monitoring and evaluation, and also the points made about development, perhaps if I combine those two in one. On the sort of micro level on monitoring and evaluation, there's a whole host of different tools that the UN uses when engaging in sustaining peace work. The Peace Building Fund, for instance, has a whole monitoring and evaluation framework, a process of independent reviews and evaluations of ongoing projects. But perhaps to answer that question at a global level, I would say the benchmark for sustaining peace really is this recognition that sustainable, inclusive development through the 2030 agenda and rooted in human rights is the paramount goal of the UN in support of member states. And so the Sustainable Development Goals are the benchmark also for sustaining peace. And sustainable inclusive development is also the best defence against violent conflict and instability, not only through Goal 16, but across the whole range of sustainable development goals. So really just to reinforce the points that my colleagues have already made so eloquently.
Great, thanks, Chelsea. I'm conscious of time, so I think that we unfortunately will have to start wrapping up this discussion. And to do that, I'll call on Brigitte Murat, the U.S. Senior Representative, the U.S. Representative for Peace Direct, to come and wrap up the discussion today.
Thanks, Leslie. Thanks so much to everyone. I feel like we were just scratching the surface and beginning to get into some really helpful conversation about this intersection between nonviolent action, peace building, and the UN's agenda. There will be further discussion, I'm sure, and I encourage that with all of you. I do just want to say thank you to IPI, to USIP, to our remarkable speakers and the work that you do with many other people in the UN system and around the world. This is a part of a series of events that we've been co-hosting together about the role of civil society in the Sustaining Peace agenda. It'll continue. There was a blog that I hope you see related to this event. If not, check that out. And I want to note the timeliness of this with the high-level event coming up. Also, for me as a U.S. citizen, just a week or so after the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination. So the power of nonviolent movements is fundamental. And figuring out how we can better integrate that into the UN's agenda, not just in some of the very helpful recommendations that are being put forward in the language, but the real practical implementation. What does this mean for civil society and its engagement with the UN? I was reflecting that the UN wasn't built for engaging with youth demands. It wasn't built for engaging with people power. And we're in a process now of trying to catch up the systems with the lofty goals that we do all share. So looking forward to thinking about how in a couple weeks, leaders from around the world can be digging into this, and we can be influencing that as well. And finally, I just want to note that we at Peace Direct, we support local peace builders around the world. Our mission is to work with local people to stop violent conflict and build sustainable peace. So we have always seen this intersection of peace building and nonviolent action in the work of our partners and what they're doing. Local actors naturally integrate different tools, and building sustainable peace and preventing violent conflict absolutely requires a broad range of nonviolent approaches, strategies, tactics, and the points of youth and women, the issue of rights being central to peace, the issue of development being central to peace, the role of movements and movement building and what that means over time, and this issue of state-society relations, and that really fundamentally is what we're trying to improve through both nonviolent movements and a sustaining peace agenda, all came through very clearly as fundamental to the UN's own agenda. So I just want to reflect on how rich this conversation has been. We have an impact report, and the front of it says, conflict is a normal part of life, violence is not. But we're reminded that conflict sometimes is necessary, and it doesn't have to be violent, used with violent tools through today's conversation. So thank you all for being here. We at Peace Direct are launching a new award. It's called Tomorrow's Peace Builders, on the intersection of nonviolent action and peace building, co-sponsored by the U.S. Institute of Peace. So we're trying to do our little part, and I hope we can all do more on this agenda moving forward. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Bridget. I'd like you now to just join me in thanking the panelists for attending today, and thank you all for joining us both online and for joining us in person. We think this event has provided a lot of good food for thought, especially with the high-level event of Sustaining Peace coming up, and we hope that it's continues the discussion on the role of local peace builders within sustaining peace. So thank you.